It's always been my goal in all these vlogs and all these podcasts, whether we're exploring Battletech, Warhammer 40K, X-Wing miniatures, Chain of Command, to share with you some of the ideas, some of the tactics that I'm working on, building that community, inspiring you, hopefully, giving you some tactics to utilize in your own games, but also ultimately this idea of the vision and the voice. Finding in terms of playing a war game. I mean, we're stepping outside of space and time, building, painting, collecting, putting aside for a moment other responsibilities, work, family, school, to roll some dice, blow some stuff up, push around some toys on the table. So let's have some fun. Let's create a narrative. Let's figure out the type of lists, the type of armies that you want to play, that I want to play, meet them on the table, and see what happens. To quote my idol Maximus, are you not entertained? But within that journey, I have to realize that there are certain laws, there are certain fundamentals. We call this the meta. I think of it as DNA, mathematical principles, rules principles, player ideas that are ultimately going to influence, whether they dictate it or not, depends if that's your player personality. It's going to dictate what happens on the tabletop. A perfect example, we're framing this as we move into this idea of a gunline for the narrative. There are some players out there that enjoy playing a war game from a completely competitive perspective. What I mean by that is they look at the rule set and their unit evaluation for whatever that narrative is based on just what works. What's the absolute best unit, model, element that they can take. And that's the only criteria. If you're not aware of that, on the opposite end, if you select models just based on looks and cool powers, nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's an important criteria for me. If you're not aware of these underpinning mechanisms, it can take you by surprise. So let's understand both sides, narrative and competitive, meet in the middle, and allow you to evolve. I lay down that foundation because the idea behind a gunline army, it seems very simple, but there again is this DNA, this meta that works. A gunline army is essentially where you just, and I'm going to simplify it a little bit, you set up all your toys and you just, in the shooting phase or whatever element of shooting it is, whether it's lasers, missiles, autocannons, psi powers, whatever it's going to be, you just blast and blast and blast and blast and blast, and you literally just blow your opponent off the table. It's essentially line up and shoot. It's easy and it looks easy because you just lay out your models and roll lots of dice, but there are some fundamentals underneath, and let's explore some of those fundamentals. So you can utilize this to build a gunline army or defend against a gunline army. And likewise, we're talking about mass combat games. Especially with 9th edition 40K just escalating the models on the table even more and more. Side note, we're going to get into, but just when I think Games Workshop has spammed out enough stuff and the game has gotten massive in size, they inflate it even more. And that makes sense because they're there to sell models. The game is secondary. So it doesn't surprise me that more and more stuff makes it to the table in an average-sized game. And on top of that, they're shrinking table sizes, and we'll push that aside for a moment. But I say that because a gunline army, substitute army with elements, you can play, and this is what I've been noticing. I've been playing some more skirmish-type games, smaller model counts. Think of a warband, 5 to 8 models. And what's interesting in skirmish is you can take the principles of the gunline army, inject it into skirmish, and I was going to say literally blast people away. And a lot of skirmish players, a lot of smaller players that experience wargaming through that lens, like Malifaux, things like that, they haven't been ready for it. They're not ready for it. They don't really see it. You see it most evident in mass combat, mass scale lineup and shoot games, maybe like Warhammer 40K. So there are opportunities beyond just mass combat games to utilize this principle. Let's dive in. This idea of the dice, especially if it's a D6 system. You have to beat certain things, and I'm going to be condensing a little bit. You have to beat certain things. I call them gates. You have to pass through certain gates where the dice pool gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So if I look at Chain of Command, I've got, 6 riflemen and 2 machine gunners. Machine gunners do 8 dice each. So I take those 8 dice, and then I put in the other 4 dice for my riflemen because 2 of them are acting as loaders for the machine gun. That's the pool of dice. That's what I start with. If I roll flawlessly, and you're never going to roll flawlessly, that is the maximum. Higher math here for a second. It's late. I'm going to do the higher math. 8, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I'm starting with 20 dice. 20 dice? 20 dice to roll. Based on, now this is where we get into chain of command, based on their skill level. If they're regular infantry, elite, or green, I might need 3s to hit. I might need 4s. I might need 5s. Let's just go with 4s to hit. I roll those dice for higher hits. My dice pool is going to drop from 20 to 12 to 13, somewhere around there, depending on how the dice gods favor me. So this idea is we're now moving through this gate, right? Big pool to a smaller pool. Now it switches over to what I'm shooting at. Is it in cover? Are they obscured? This idea that I have to wound or score kills, I'm utilizing this idea from Chain of Command. We're pulling that in. In Chain of Command, a 4 or 5 is shock. I don't kill someone, but I rattle them, and a 6 is a kill. So I roll those 12 dice. If they're behind cover, then a 5 is a shock, a 6 is kill. So to illustrate this point, the actual units that I remove off the table, the actual models of yours that I remove off the table, it's going to be a lot smaller. So the first thing with a gunline army, roll lots and lots and lots of dice. You need to start with the biggest pool possible. If you have impossible odds to beat, we see this with the idea of the D6 system, where you might have a unit that's really, really tough. So in order to score any wounds or kills, you need 6s. Well, if I roll tons and tons of dice, I'm going to get more 6s. Likewise with elements of range. So when you build your army list, when you pull in units, you're just looking at stuff. You are looking at quantity over quality. And quantity has its own quality. Getting the most amount of stuff on the table. Usually we see this with just whatever is in your army list. Cheap troops, cheap bodies, the least amount of points. Spam out tons and tons and tons and tons of dice. That's the first element. Now, a lot of gunline armies just operate at this, and they can be successful because this is called a mono build. Often what we see in Tactica with a war game, and again, you're looking at your system. We're trying to stay system independent. There's different phases of the game. You have a movement phase, you have a shooting phase, might have a magic phase, you've got an assault, close combat phase, right? Battletech, we've got movement, we've got shooting, we've got physical attacks. Pulling all those aspects into the game, a lot of people will take their army and divide it into different pieces. Maybe you have elements that are shock troops for close combat. Maybe you have dedicated heavy weapon teams. You spread your army over different areas. Gunline is focused. It's a mono build. You're taking all of your units, whatever currency you're using to buy those units, power points, squadron points, battle value, and putting it into Gunline. That makes it, just on that alone, makes it very, very efficient because I can't match your shooting on that alone. Can't match your shooting on that alone because I've divided my army up into other aspects. Now, the foil on that is if I have elements that are assault-based and I manage to slip your gunline and get in, then you just have no defense. So what we see is the gunline, the players that operate or understand the gunline is just spamming out dice. It works. There's no disputing that. Mathematically, rules-wise, just everything. Unit efficiency. But we want to take it to that next level. So there's this idea of, in a war game modified by the mission, you're kind of on your side of the table, your deployment zone with your toys. I'm on my side of the table with my toys. I'm going to try and be as far as I can against the edge of the board, and I'm going to shoot, 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 and shoot. You're going to cross the table to get into range, to assault, to be able to engage me in whatever capacity that takes as your army. I want you out in that midfield. I want you pushed away from my gun line as long as I can. So the idea is, as you advance your forward units, I'm able to kill those off and now a fresh line of units come up. I'm able to kill those off or remove them off the table. This idea that as you're moving across the table, I have a number of turns to shoot and engage you. If you can magically appear in front of me, teleport in, speed, zoom in, or tunnel in, whatever it's going to be, or just you move fast, you're all mech'd up, right? You're mobile, blitzkrieg, then I'll have one turn of shooting, you're on top of me. So I need some way to keep you in that mid-band of the gaming table so that all my units are in range, and turn after turn after turn, I just roll dice and dice and dice and grind you down. We do that with what's called a speed bump type unit. This is a unit in the Gunline that it's going to have some shooty ability, but I'm looking for that combination. And again, you're going to have to look into your own gaming system. I'm looking for that combination of mass model size, big model size, but low points, because essentially this is a sacrificial unit. Warhammer 40,000, the classic Imperial Guard, penal division, just lots of conscripts, or we see with chaos cultists, paying 3, 4, 5 points a model, Tyranids, Gaunts. I mean, there's a lot. Battletech, just infantry, 58 battle value a stand, and just these blocking units that they stay with the Gunline. They're not necessarily skirmishers. They stay with the Gunline, but as your opponent moves forward, you send these units, elements, models out to the midfield to just stand there and park and block and get assaulted and shoot. You're going to lose them. But they buy you an extra 1, 2, 3 turns of everything else on your backfield shooting. This is the speed bump. You're slowing down your opponent. Not necessarily going to be able to stop them, but I'm slowing them down. If you have that element, now it increases the efficiency of your dice. The final piece depends on deployment. Now, naturally, things are going to be modified a little bit by terrain. You're going to try and occupy key terrain to give you elevation or advantages to shooting. You can get an idea if you're a Gunline army of where your opponent's going to try and deploy, because as they move, they're looking to move behind buildings or get cover or block line of sight, so at least they don't get exposed to shooting for the entire aspect of the game. Those modifications you'll have to move with deployment. But what we also see sometimes is if your opponent has a very fast or mobile army, and you're a Gunline, and you're like, look, Fritz, I've got the speed bump. I'm going to work on deployment, but I really don't think I can stop my opponent from making it in and tying me up, whether that's in the assault or close shooting. Then we look at this idea of castling up, where you use the physical boundaries of the table, usually in the left side or the right side corner. Again, what you pick is modified by terrain. Going to that corner, so now you physically limit, you physically condense, you cut down the areas of approach, the avenues of approach that your opponent can approach. You funnel them in. Physically, the footprint of their models means less can make it in. That means you can fire all of your army, all of your elements on one unit, get it off the table. Next unit, get it off the table. Next unit, get it off the table. So Gunlines, facing them can be a little frustrating, especially if the Gunline opponent knows how to play it. Because on the surface, it looks like this is a little bit beardy, right? My man's just taking tons of units, spamming them out. What's worse, they're not even painted, and they're just rolling lots and lots of dice, and they think they're an amazing general, and they're beating me. Maybe. But I wanted to push this up to the archives because there's a little bit more behind the scenes. There is skill. There is finesse. There is an understanding in running the Gunline and being able to see and implement a little bit beyond it. Side note, you're running a small war band, 5, 6, 7, 8 models. Build a Gunline with that. Build a Gunline with the idea of having those models, having missile weapons, shooting weapons, psionic powers. A great reference, Mordheim, playing that with my Cult of the Possessed. The Possessed is the blocking speed bump unit. The Brethren and everybody else, the Dark Soul, the Magister, they have shooting elements to some degree. And that's an example of a small Gunline principle build brought down to that skirmish level.